everybody. You're very welcome to session 4 today. And today we're going to be talking about sustainable transport and behavioral change. And I have to say, I'm really, really looking forward to this session. I think that these two issues have become more important than ever before. COVID has showed us all that we can work in a different way, we can travel in a different way, and I'm so pleased that we have the experts that we have with us today to discuss these issues. We have Dr. Lorraine D'Arcy. She's from the School of Transport, Environment and Planning at TU Dublin. She'll be discussing low carbon transport and mobility. We're also joined by Geraldine Herbert, contributing editor and motoring correspondent for the Sunday Independent, and she'll be talking about the challenges of meeting electric car national targets. And then we have Dr. Eleanor Denny, Associate Professor of Economics at TCD, nudging climate action using behavioral science. So looking forward to a lively discussion. I hope that you'll have lots and lots of questions for us. We've all decided we're going to try and be a little bit provocative if we can this late in the afternoon to keep you all interested. So I'm going to start now with Dr. Lorraine D'Arcy. Take it away, Lorraine.
So thanks very much. So hi, everyone. So today, it's such a diverse topic, low carbon transport mobility. How can we narrow that down? So I'm just going to focus on, first of all, let's talk the two terms. Transport, something we generally consider to be the movement of vehicles and goods, and mobility, the movement of people. And what I'm going to put to you today is that really we should be focusing on the mobility part. So first of all, what I want you to consider is, I never check. Oh, hold on, the screen. Oh, sorry, my slides aren't moving on. So mild panic for a second. No, okay. So I'm just going to be talking to you. So the first thing I'm going to put to you is that whose behavior needs to change and why. And so think about that, please. So as we talk and right through this session, continuously ask yourself whose behavior is it that needs to change. And then next of all, then we should really think about the person in the center of it, that we need to put the human back into human mobility. Because, we started out in villages, right? Our first congregation was in villages, and we could access right up until the 1940s, 50s, 60s, until probably the 60s. We could access everything we needed to access within a 10 to 15 minute walk from our homes every day. If we needed to go further, we got public transport or shared transport to take us on to those next places, those other places. And really, that's what we want to come back to now, right? That there's emphasis now on this 10-minute, 15-minute village and town, and that is in both an urban and a rural context. And then good public transport links to take us where else we need to go. And what has happened over the years is, unfortunately, I don't have the slide for this one for you, that, from an engineering perspective, we have put an emphasis on the success in relation to transport being related to time, that it was about getting there faster. And when there was a prominence on the movement and accessing to the city centre in particular for our work, that we carved our way through our villages. And both in urban, again in a rural context, we carved these wide roads. And to increase time even further, we removed our pedestrian crossings. We made it more difficult for the human to actually cross and utilize their whole environment within their locality. And, and we continue to, we made this so difficult now that, we now, people, and when it comes to that trip to school, which we should really be easily able to do in a few minutes, or to the shops, that we're now sitting into a 1,800 kilogram vehicle to move a 70 kilogram person to go collect, if they're going to the shops, for a litre of milk and a newspaper for a kilogram of goods. Is that really an efficient use of our energy? And given that the fact that 14% of all cause premature mortality in Ireland, 14% is due to physical inactivity. Now, that's just the inactivity element of it. When it comes to our health, we know that people who live in high walkable areas have an 8-year delay in the onset of dementia, that they are happier, and there's a lot more health benefits in relation to that as well. So we want to focus on that livability and walkability. The thing is that as we make places more walkable, they're prone to gentrification. People want to live there, and there's a danger in us leaving neighborhoods behind. And there is an inequity. There can be an inequity in place, because even in places that we might think are high walkable for us, are they high walkable for everyone across the life course? Is it still a high walkable location for people who are wheelchair users, pushing buggies, older people, or are they feeling uncomfortable? Because comfort is key, and we need to have an equity in voices as well. Socioeconomics is a determinant of health and well-being, but also when it comes to behaviour change, we know from our health interventions in relation to smoking cessation and other interventions, that those from lower socioeconomic groups are more likely to have greater pressures and stresses on their lives, which therefore make it more difficult for them to overcome the barriers to change in making their decisions. And one of the things when it comes to that, like, and also we make a lot of presumptions and assumptions. We don't have a good baseline. We don't have good baseline information in Ireland in relation to what people want, need in their daily lives. We have a lot of information about what people currently do, but we don't know what are the current determinants of what they do. Also in socioeconomic areas, when it comes to walkability, there's a greater emphasis on their decision based on their security and sense of personal safety. But also we have to question, what is it? What makes people think that they're safe? Is it car advertising? They're telling us the quickest and safest way. They're never stuck in traffic in car ads for some bizarre reason. So where are we getting our information from? We've known for years roads are good as being kind of the mantra that has been put to us, because there's a perception we're going to get there quicker, but there's very little conversation about the greater impacts. When it comes to investment in walking, cycling and public transport, and we should always consider public transport as an active mode of transport, because there is a walking or cycling trip at either end. And when we invest heavily in the design and implementation of our rail systems, we don't always think about the environment outside and what are those linkages like, because that, really, like, we measure the success of rail and public transport on ridership, but our ridership might be prevented from getting there because of the walkability of the neighborhoods around it. And this excuse me, and there are gender implications of that. Excuse me. And gender inability is a consideration too. So we'll come back to it in the questions, but I'm just going to say, let's think back on whose behaviour needs to change, and we'll chat more in a few minutes.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Lorraine, for that. And I'm glad you have a glass of water there. I have one too. I think that's very interesting when you're talking about whose behaviors need to change, and the idea of how we used to have the 10 to 15 minute livable and walkable and good transport links, and that 14% of deaths statistics and preventable death statistics is very interesting. I just want to expand a little bit on Lorraine's bio before we move into Geraldine's presentation. Lorraine is also a civil engineer with a PhD in exercise and environmental psychology. And in TU Dublin, she's been instrumental in setting up a new part-time MSc in sustainable transport and mobility aimed at upskilling transport practitioners and those interested in a career in sustainable mobility. Now, if you have any questions for us for the Q&A afterwards, there's a button you should see on the right-hand side that says Q&A. So if you can use the Q&A section and not the chat function, we'd really appreciate it. So now I would like to introduce Geraldine Herbert. And she, as I said, is the contributing editor and correspondent with the Sunday Independent and a regular contributor to radio and TV, including RTE, Virgin Media, and the BBC. She's written about transport and motoring for over 2 decades. And I have to say, she gets to drive some very cool cars, including some electric cars, and she's a graduate of NUI and Trinity College and holds an MPhil and a postgraduate diploma in statistics from the School of Computer Science and Statistics in TCD. She's a foundation scholar of the college and was awarded an I/C SET scholarship to undertake a PhD in computer science. Take it away, Geraldine.
Thank you, Margaret. Now I'm going to talk about the challenges of meeting electric car national targets, and I'm under strict instructions to keep this brief, so I'm going to be as brief as I can. So first of all, we look at the actual targets. So on my slide, you can see here, okay, so Ireland has joined a number of countries in Europe to actually set a date to ban the sale of petrol and diesel cars. So to this end, we have a national target of having 840,000 EVs on the road and 100,000 electric vans. Now, to date, we have about 25,000 electric cars on the road. Last year, over 4,000 battery electric cars were sold and 2,500 plug-in hybrids. This accounts for about 8% of a market share of new car sales. Now, this might sound quite small, but it's actually up from 4% in 2019. So we are getting there. Now, I will next look at the car fleet. So the car fleet is actually about 2.8 million. So the plan is to make a third of this electric. Now, these projections were probably, and these targets were based on pre-COVID and pre-Brexit. Both are going to have a significant impact on our car fleet for the simple reason that our car fleet grows both through new registrations, new car sales and imports. Now, obviously, COVID has had a very damaging effect on our entire economy, and our car market is no different. The car market is down 25% on last year. Now, the positive note, I suppose, is that EVs are up. They were up 16%. But also imports are going to be significantly impacted by Brexit. There's new customs and new VAT rates are going to be introduced for importing a car from the UK. So imports are going to become very unattractive in the future. So having said this, I think it's going to be an incredible challenge to meet these numbers. But I don't think that we should actually judge the success of any EV policy by the number of EVs we put on the road. I think a far more constructive approach would be to look at a growing market share. And I think it's very reasonable to expect that that market share is going to grow year on year to about 5% every year until about 2025, and then could actually grow by 10% in the years from 2025 to 2030. So that's what I think we should be looking at, rather than trying to substitute petrol and diesel cars, each petrol and diesel for an electric car. Now, if we look at the obstacles to actually achieving these targets, probably the first for the consumer is price. Now, the reason price is such an issue with EVs is it's not that EVs are exorbitantly priced, it's the fact that there's a premium to be paid when you compare them to the equivalent petrol and diesel cars. So you can see from the slide here, these are just two examples of many that you could use. If you walk into one of these dealerships and you look at the exact same model of petrol, diesel, and electric, you're asked to pay a far higher premium for the electric car. Now, we know that the total cost of ownership is much cheaper for running an EV, the servicing is much cheaper, but it's still a large investment for people to make in advance and then recoup it. Now, this will be addressed in the next few years. The big issue here is the cost of the battery, and this accounts for about a third of the price of electric cars. The battery costs are likely to come down. They've reduced considerably in the last decade. They've even gone down another 17% last year. So they will come down, and we would expect by about 2025, on the most, probably maybe nearly as near as 2023, that we will see this price parity. And when we see that, we will see a considerable shift in market penetration for electric cars. Now, moving to the public charging network, obviously range is another big issue with people, but range has become less important as the range in electric cars has got better. Most new cars now do anything from 300 to 450 kilometres between each charge. And so while most people, according to the last CSO survey, don't do anything more than about 300 kilometres in an entire week, and that's your average driver, I think the longer we spend in traffic and in congestion, the more we think we drive more, but we don't. The public charging network has seen considerable investment in the last while. Again, unfortunately, due to COVID, this has stalled somewhat, but it will face challenges also in the future, though. The Transport and Environment, the European agency, believe that we need about 26,000 chargers between now and 2030 and about 12,000 by 2025. So we do need to see even more significant investment in the public charging network. And this is a way of reassuring people that they can go electric. They need to see an accessible, well-maintained and well-visible charging network in order to make that leap. I think also with the plug-in hybrids, because they have much lower, smaller range than electric cars, they need the reassurance of work chargers and supermarket chargers and other kind of frequent chargers like that. So that is really the challenge for the public charging network. Now, moving on to car makers, obviously somebody has to produce these cars. Now, you'll see from this slide that all car makers are working towards an EV future. However, there isn't there isn't a unified approach. They're all working to sort of different deadlines. Now, the EV market has been, I suppose you could say, artificially held back over the last few years by a limited supply of cars. And this is largely due to the fact that for car makers, combustion technology is where the profit is, and it will continue to be so for a while. So therefore, they're more likely to continue selling, petrol and diesel cars and to market these more than electric cars at the moment, because that is where the profit is. However, the significant driver in forcing car makers to produce electric cars and low emission cars has been the EU. So moving on then to the role of the EU. It's the regulations really that the EU have brought in on CO2 emissions that have forced manufacturers to produce EVs rather than irrespective really of consumer demand, and this is going to continue, and this is probably why one of the reasons the lack of models will be addressed quite considerably this year. We see a lot of new EVs coming this year, both plug-in hybrids and battery electric, and it's in order to meet these tough CO2 emission targets that the EU have set. Now, there are more targets in 2025 and even more strict targets again in 2030. There is probably the EU could be doing a bit more, and there is a call from some sectors to actually put in a 2027 target, because the worry is that car makers the market itself will stagnate between 2025 and 2030, because car makers will meet their targets by 2025, but they won't have any need to kind of to speed up any more until maybe 2028, 2029. So if there was another target in 27, this would move things along a bit better. Then moving from the role of the EU down to actual then government policy and government initiatives. Obviously, the government plays a huge role in encouraging people to buy electric cars. We do have some very generous subsidies and incentives in at the moment. There you can see on the screen some of the ones that are there at the moment. Also, the last budget introduced changes to the RT. There are other things the government could be looking at. In the States, it proved that reducing electricity to encourage people to move to electric cars, but increasing the cost of fuel was very instrumental. We know that throughout Europe, measures where the government make it more expensive to buy and own petrol and diesel cars moves people very quickly towards alternative fuels. The problem with both of those is they would be deeply unpopular, and there is a social equity issue. They are probably the most significant or the most useful of the incentives or policies that governments can bring in. Now, in terms of incentives, probably the country that has managed this best is Norway, and you can't really have a discussion about EVs without mentioning Norway. Norway has been hugely successful. However, it's important to understand why Norway has been successful, and really the key reason that they have had such a success is to do with price parity with petrol and diesel. They heavily penalise petrol and diesel cars, and they very generously subsidise electric cars. So when you walk into a dealership, all three cars will be similarly priced, but when you work out how cheap it is to run an EV, it doesn't make financial sense for a lot of people not to go EV. But the other things you have to look at in terms of Norway is they obviously have high income levels. They have introduced other incentives like access to bus lanes, free tolls, free ferries. And also one of the things that is largely forgotten about when people discuss Norway and their success with EVs is they have introduced this in conjunction to introducing car-free policies in their cities. Oslo has removed up to 800 parking spaces. They have designated a number of their key streets and key roads as car-free. So it's not something that has been done in isolation. And I think that's something that doesn't get stressed often enough when we talk about Norway. So now moving on to the consumer, the SEAI have identified a number of barriers towards buying electric cars by consumers, and a lot of them we know. A few of the ones we haven't covered up to now, the behavioural issues. This is just generally that people don't understand the implications of owning an electric car. I think 48% of the people surveyed by the SEAI had no idea where their nearest charging point is, and about 82% overestimated the time it took to charge an electric car. So these are things we can address, but these will automatically be addressed by actually just putting more cars, more EVs on the road, because people will know people who have EVs, they'll see them at the school and they'll just generally know more about them. The knowledge gap is another interesting one. This is to do with the fact that consumers or motorists underestimate the cost of petrol and diesel cars to run. So it's interesting that when we talk about electric cars and we try and promote them, we promote how cheap they are to run, but actually that's wasted if we don't in tandem inform people and educate people about how costly their own car is to run at the moment, because without that they don't see the benefits. So I think there's a shift in the way we market EVs that needs to happen there. And also in terms of the dealerships, these obviously car dealerships play a big role in trying to influence people's buying behaviour. And again, research around Europe would suggest that dealerships are not that committed to selling electric cars, in the sense that, this is not to say for all of them, but in the sense that they perceive them as being something that takes longer to explain to consumers, and there isn't as much profitability on them. Now, no such study has been done in Ireland, but it would be interesting to see what the sort of what would happen if we did some surveys on car dealerships and their attitude to selling electric cars. So finally, in summary, the key thing to selling electric cars is that they have to become price competitive. So price parity is key, and the role of incentives is hugely important. But I think particularly post-COVID, resources are limited, and we have to be very clear on which resources we use and how incentives are used and get the best out of them. And also, I think it's very clear, instead of having a target for the number of cars we're going to put on the road, we should focus not simply therefore on replacing petrol and diesel cars with an EV, but rather provide people with more transport options. And I think this is key to any overall strategy. So thank you. I'll hand you back to Margaret, and I hope that wasn't too fast.
You did very well there, Geraldine.
I don't know what time it took, but I'm not even going to ask.
I'm not telling. That was super. Thank you very much. Really appreciate that. Really interesting about some of the challenges. And I know that some of us have experienced those. My husband, for example, actually has an electric vehicle. And talking about behavior next on this is Dr. Eleanor Denny, and she's an associate professor in the economics department of Trinity and a fellow of Trinity College Dublin. Her research interests lie in energy, behavioral and experimental economics, and she's published widely in these areas. She's an independent expert on the National Economic and Social Council, an external advisory board member of the Irish Government Economic Evaluation Service, and the Behavioural Economics Unit at Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland. Thank you so much. You're very welcome. Eleanor.
Thank you very much, Margaret, and it's a pleasure to be here today, and in particular to see an all-female panel for transport is a very welcome change. So what I'd like to talk about briefly is looking at how we can encourage behaviour change when it comes to transport. And in order to encourage behaviour change, we kind of have to understand how people make decisions in the first place. So I was asked to talk about nudging climate action. So first of all, I just wanted to kind of define what a nudge is so that we're kind of on the same starting point. So basically, a nudge is something in the environment that catches our attention and influences our behavior. And when it comes to transport or mobility, we these things are around us, but we may not necessarily identify them as nudges. So the example of the calorie counter on the stairs, it's something in our environment, it catches our attention and it might encourage us to take the stairs. Likewise, when we come up to a junction, let's say on a motorway, and we see those lines on the road that are getting closer and closer together, that's a safety nudge that's nudging us to slow down as we get closer to the junction. But what I would say about a nudge is, number one, it's not a mandate. So we're not banning people from using the escalator or the lift. We're just gently nudging them or encouraging them towards using the stairs. So it's not we're not banning one option, or we're not requiring a particular option. So a nudge is just a kind of a non-price incentive to encourage us to take a particular course of action. And I will emphasize that. So it's not a financial incentive. So it's not to do with changing the prices or changing taxes or subsidies and so on. So a nudge is, you know, it's kind of helping us make better choices. And when we think about designing nudges, we kind of have to understand how we as individuals make decisions. And in that respect, I'd like to just touch on 3 key behavioral insights. So the first is that for humans, our behavior will tend to stay the same unless we either remove a friction or increase a fuel. So what I mean by that is our behavior with respect to transport is going to stay the way it is now, unless we remove some obstacle that's preventing us from perhaps cycling more or using public transport more often or buying an electric vehicle. So our behavior will stay the same unless we remove some sort of obstacle that's preventing us from changing our behavior, or we increase a fuel. And by that, I mean increase our motivation to change our behavior. A second behavioral insight that would be important is that we are social creatures and we respond to social cues and we respond to you know, what our peers are doing and what we see other people in society doing. And the third insight from behavioral economics, it would be that we often have, or we pay attention to, limited information. So it's sometimes the case, you know, that we don't have the information that we need in order to make the best decision that we can when it comes to transport. So what I want to do is I want to talk through some examples from the transport sector about where we could potentially use these behavioral insights to encourage behavior change. And the first one that I'm going to talk about is in relation to cycling. So, and I'm conscious that it may be difficult to see these graphics, the numbers on these graphics. So I'm just going to basically give you the highlight, which is that cycling numbers in Ireland continue to be extremely low. And although they have been growing in the past decade, this is data from the census in 2016, we still see that less than 5% of people use the bicycle as their primary mode of transportation or their mode of transportation for commuting. And within cycling then, we see a significant gender difference. So less than a quarter of cyclists on our roads are female cyclists. And I think this graphic here is really telling in terms of what these two pictures show is where people are cycling from in their commute. And we see that the male cyclists have a much wider geographic area where they're cycling from for their commute, you know, Blanchardstown, Kiltiernan, Shankill. So they're coming in from a much broader area compared to the female cyclists. So if we want to encourage more people to cycle, and in particular, perhaps we want to in particular, incentivize more females to cycle, we have to understand what is at the root, that like what's preventing people from cycling. So in this study that we did, we looked at the CSO and we looked at what areas are correlated with low cycling rates. And we see, obviously, from the previous graphic, that distance to the city centre is a key factor that is you know, influencing the cycling rate. But also we see that areas that have a large penetration of apartment buildings have low cycling rates, and areas of low education have low cycling rates. So when we think about removing friction, so removing obstacles to cycling, okay, when we think about distance to the city centre, so one strategy that could help overcome or help reduce that barrier to cycling would be better access to electric bikes, because the electric bike will help reduce the effort required to travel from a further distance, and that could have a particular influence on the likelihood of females to cycle. Then we should look at facilities at work for bike storage, for lockers for your clothes, for changing facilities, for showering facilities, and so on. So these sort of a lack of those facilities is influencing people's decisions when it comes to whether they will cycle or not. Likewise, facilities at home. So what we see in apartment blocks, so newer built apartment blocks are better in terms of their cycling infrastructure, in terms of their storage and so on. But older apartment buildings don't have those sort of facilities, and it appears that living in an apartment, particularly for females, is a deterrent to cycling. So it could be down to carrying your bike up the stairs or a lack of storage within the apartment itself. And we also have to recognize, and this is something that Lorraine touched on already, that the vast majority of our journeys involve trip chaining. So what I mean by that is walking to, let's say, the bus station or the train station, and then taking a public transport, or cycling to the train station and parking your bike and then getting on the train. So if we want to encourage people to use public transport and use cycling as a means of transport, we need to improve the cycling infrastructure around those key public transport locations, so that people feel that they have a secure and safe location to store their bikes. And the other thing that we found in that study was that routes into the city centre with very high shares of separated or off-road bicycle lanes have significantly higher cycling rates. So if we want to encourage more people to cycle, we need to improve that cycling infrastructure and have continuous and segregated bicycle lanes. So those would be examples of removing frictions, okay, removing obstacles to cycling. Another way to change behavior is to what we call add a fuel, or to make the positive behavior more appealing. So examples in this space could be, you know, community competitions in terms of, you know, or games between schools and workplaces in terms of the number of people in that workplace who are cycling into the office. In the 60s and 70s, Ireland, in fact, had a national cycling proficiency badge, and, you know, school-age children could apply for this cycling proficiency badge. One could think of, you know, certification schemes that could be introduced in schools now that would encourage students to walk or to cycle to school, and kind of have a visible display that they did that. Or even like a green schools type approach, you could have a green business type approach where they got certification based on the number of people that were cycling or walking or using public transport to access their workplace. So making positive behavior more appealing is also a way of changing behavior. And when we think about trying to encourage people to use public transport, we can use the same metrics. So what are the obstacles that are stopping people from using public transport? Overcrowding at peak times, a sense that, you know, sometimes the service is unreliable. For people who are trip chaining, they may, you know, be dropping their children to school and then traveling on into work. A lack of proper storage facilities at public transport locations to store the accessories that you might need to travel with children. And a key thing is recognizing that usage of public transport isn't, people don't use public transport in isolation. They have to get to the train station or the bus stop and get home again. And oftentimes the infrastructure in that segment of their journey is lacking in terms of street lighting, in terms of, you know, bicycle lanes or whatever. And, you know, we need people to be comfortable and to be safe in accessing public transport. So we need to look at the full journey, not just the public transport section. So another way that we can look at behavior is we are social creatures and we respond to social cues. And for those of you who are familiar with the electricity sector, there's a famous experiment that was implemented by O-Power in the United States, which is a utility company, and they introduced electricity bills that gave you your usage compared to your neighbors. Okay, and they told you, you know, you're using 35% more energy than your neighbors. You know, here are some tips to help you change your behavior. And that experiment was shown to be, you know, quite significant in terms of changing people's behavior. And the reason why it worked is because we are social creatures and we respond to these social cues. So thinking about how that might work in the context of the transport sector, well, it's been shown that there is safety in numbers, if you like, when it comes to cycling. And particularly when we see more cyclists on a route, that it's kind of like a self-fulfilling thing. People are more likely to cycle when they see more cyclists on the road. So if we can build the infrastructure and kind of encourage more people to cycle, that will be self-fulfilling in itself. The more people cycling on the road, will lead to growth in that space. We also see in cars, you'll often see for a hybrid or for a plug-in hybrid or an electric vehicle, they have like a blue trim or a green trim on the car. So that's kind of signaling to people that your car is a more efficient or more environmentally friendly vehicle. And another way to kind of signal or to use social cues is something that they're looking at introducing in the UK, which is to have a number plate which clearly signals that this car is a lower emissions car. So, you know, a green number plate for more efficient vehicles, and a red number plate for, you know, diesel or petrol. So these are examples of kind of social signaling or responding to social cues. And the third behavioral insight that I just wanted to mention was when it comes to limited information. So air travel is kind of a lesser talked about element of transport behavior. And a lot of people don't know the kind of carbon consequences of their air travel. So for example, a round trip from Berlin to Barcelona for a family of 4 would emit 2 tons of CO2, which is more than a typical car emits in a year. And another thing that people don't realize is that there's huge differences in the CO2 footprint between different airlines. So for the same journey, you know, from Dublin to Paris, there can be, you know, differences of up to 50–60% depending on the fleet and depending on the actual the airline and the fleet that airline has. So we did a behavioral experiment to see what the impact of making people aware of the carbon consequences of their flights would have. So this is a behavioral type choice experiment, and we asked people, you know, we said to people, you're going to the wedding of a close friend in Athens. These are 2 flights. Which flight would you choose? And you can see different attributes of the flight, you know, the departure time, the price, the baggage, the amount of baggage that they could have, the connections and so on. And we also included a CO2 rating for the flight that was on a typical like energy rating scale from A to G. And we asked people to make this choice on numerous times, and then we can work out how people value different aspects of the flight. So what we find is that people much prefer morning flights. Okay, so they'll be willing to pay €68 more for a flight in the morning. They like more baggage allowance. So for every kilogram of extra baggage, they're willing to pay €3 more for each kilo. People really don't like flight connections, and they're willing to pay €88 more to avoid a flight connection. But what we were really interested in is what was the impact of showing them the CO2 information. And what we see is that showing that CO2 information led people to choose more efficient or less emission flights with less emissions, even when those flights cost more money. So they were willing to choose a more expensive flight if it had a lower CO2 emissions. And at the moment, CO2 emissions for individual flights is not something that is readily available information for people. And what we see is that people were willing to pay €77 more for a flight that had 1 ton less of CO2 emissions. So this is a really high willingness to pay for lower CO2 air travel. And this would be kind of overcoming, this would be using what we know about behavioral economics, okay, a lack of information. By providing that information to people, we can actually induce a behavior change to encourage people to demand more lower CO2 flights, and that'll then lead to airlines to perhaps upgrade their fleets in that way. So basically, in summary, if you want to influence people's transport behavior and you want to do it using kind of behavioral insights, what we need to do is remove friction, so remove barriers that are preventing them from taking certain transport options as it is, increase motivations to make them want to change, introduce some social cues, and overcome information gaps. So with that, Margaret, I'll hand back over to you.
Thank you very much there, Dr. Denny. Really appreciate it. People's behaviors are always so interesting, aren't they? I'm delighted to say we have loads of questions, which is great because we've made way for lots of questions. But before I start asking you those, I have a question. So a lot of the work that I do with leadership consultancy is with top management. And I would often talk to them about having a flexible workforce, which means that you'd have greater diversity and inclusion if you allowed people to work from home. So I've had a virtual company for 15 years. And when I encourage people to do this with at least part of their workforce, they would laugh. You know, they said, oh, they won't be as productive. No, we need people commuting into the city center for work. So I'm just wondering how much you think that COVID has changed attitudes towards sustainable transport and maybe more permanent ways for people to work from home. So maybe they can live in rural Ireland and work from a technology center there and work then. Do you think COVID has moved us well ahead in terms of sustainable transport and behavioral change in this area? Eleanor, I might start with you on that, please.
So I think that in the sense that while this situation was forced upon us, it did require workplaces to recognize that in fact work can still continue when people are working from home. I think for people's well-being, that I think that there is still scope for a workplace, perhaps, you know, that could be operated on, you know, a hot desking type arrangement, that you don't need to have the full workforce in the workplace at a given time. And I think it allows us to introduce a lot more flexibility into the transport system. So we no longer potentially need a rush hour in the morning and a rush hour in the evening, you know, that we can have these much more flexible arrangements throughout the day that would reduce kind of the burden on our existing system and perhaps be able to use the existing system more efficiently and effectively. So,
and Dr. D'Arcy, what do you think about that based on your findings?
So in relation to COVID, from that like village and locality perspective, what has happened is people have become more aware of what is accessible to them within that 5 kilometers from their home, first of all. And people are having that realization of like, either this place doesn't afford me that livability or it doesn't. And in addition, there's like when it comes from an active travel perspective as well, another thing is the people that had been walking, cycling, taking public transport are less active. They're more sedentary as a result of being at home. So there, you know, there's a debate there, like people are spending more time at the computer, but how do we bring back in that physical activity? Standing desks, like now here, but and some people are doing a virtual commute as well. Just on that awareness of what's in the locality, Brendan O'Brien, head of traffic in Dublin City Council, mentioned recently that they're having an increased amount of people contacting them about the amount of traffic and rat running happening in their neighbourhoods. And there's a perception that it's worse now, when actual fact that the traffic in the city is actually down by over 30%. So it is a greater awareness of what is actually happening in your neighbourhood when you weren't there for so many hours a day. And people are becoming a bit more aware of what people, older people, people with disabilities, parents with small children have been experiencing in those places and spaces for a long time. We have overemphasized the importance of the commute for too long. And that is a very gendered approach to traffic and transportation also. Because women and those that are disadvantaged have a much more, it has a much more impact on them, on their life.
And I will go back to that gender question as well in a moment, but I just want to go to you, Geraldine, with one of the questions that's coming in here. Thank you very much, Dr. D'Arcy. So let's see, Thomas asks here, as cobalt is the essential mineral for car batteries, how can we guarantee when purchasing EVs that the cobalt is ethically sourced, and as demand for EVs increases, so too will cobalt?
Yeah, I mean, this is a big issue and car makers are well aware of it. And the EU is talking about bringing in regulation to ensure that the materials used in car batteries is sustainable and that it's ethically mined. So, I mean, there's no fast and quick solution to it, but it is something that, as I said, the car industry is very much aware of, and they're, you know, doing their best efforts to alleviate the issue at the moment. If I could also come back to just what you were saying about COVID. I think the working from home and COVID is slightly a double-edged sword. It has also made people more reluctant to use public transport, and in some way has enshrined the car as sort of a sanctuary and in a way that we haven't had before. And there is a concern, I suppose, that people will, well, we don't see car sales increasing, but we certainly see secondhand car sales increasing. So there is some sort of a move that people are just, it has in some way just made us a bit more reluctant to use public transport. And also it might in the short to long term, medium term anyway, damage car sharing initiatives and things like that. So it's not a win-win in all situations. So I think it's important to stress that as well.
Well, we have seen in bicycle sales, haven't we?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
More, they're cycling more, they're getting to know their community more. I mean, we see Dublin City Council and elsewhere, they're putting in segregated bike lanes. So people are thinking about different things, but I do take your point about not using public transport. We see empty buses, empty darts, empty trains passing here all the time. I'd say a lot of people see that as well. We have another question in here, and this is one about cars and car design, which I'm very keen on. So Geraldine, I love my cars, and I used to have vintage cars and things. I don't have them anymore. But Sarah asks, she says, for a lot of people, a car is a status symbol, and it's one of the first things we buy when we get our first job. Having a car or a particular make of a car is a sign you've made it. And there's still a certain social status associated with driving to work that cycling and public transport just doesn't have. How do we address this perception? And I'll jump in and also say, and how do we address the fact that a lot of electric vehicles are not well designed? They're not as beautiful as some of the other ones. That's my personal question.
I think that's very unfair now, Margaret. Electric vehicles have come on in leaps and bounds. You only have to think of Tesla and all the others. But
price point though, that's beyond most people's range, a Tesla.
Yeah, well, there are cheaper ones now, in fairness. So, but I mean, in terms of that, I think this is the one thing we've missed out on when we market electric cars. We have marketed them far too puritanically in terms of, they'll save the planet, you'll save. We have to remember, if we look at how car makers actually sell cars, they use terms that are very emotive, and they constantly emphasize this role of freedom, this role of security, and Lorraine touched on that as well, the safety aspect. So I think we need to learn from car companies about marketing electric cars as well, and we need to look at that. And there's if we want to look at, I mean, this is one of the big discussions about sustainability and transport, is how do we get people out of their cars? We fail to see that most people drive because they really like driving. So we need to address that as well. But also there's an issue there that people drive because journeys are getting longer, and that's a planning issue as well. So I think there's a lot more to getting people out of their cars than simply just, selling an alternative. So I think we need to be mindful of that. In terms of electric cars, though, I mean, I think, it's got to the stage now when they first came out, they looked like they were the green alternative. Now you barely notice. I mean, in some ways that's an issue as well, which we don't even notice now what's electric and what's not. So they've caught up very much in terms of design.
Well, I'll argue that another day. So a couple of questions here about the price of EVs. So Carl here is saying, can we address equity concerns by using tax revenues generated from increased taxes on ICE to reduce the price of electric vehicles?
Yeah, I mean, I touched on this already. The biggest issue with electric cars at the moment is the cost of the battery. The battery price needs to come down. Once that comes down and we have price competitiveness, we will see a big shift towards electric cars. We see that in Norway because they've created that situation artificially. I think there's a role there about incentives, though. We've started doing this in the last budget. The over 50,000 price band does not get as much aid as they did before. I think definitely, if you're buying an 80 or 90,000 euro car, having 5,000 off it is not really going to be that much of a difference. If you take that 5,000, add another 10 to it, and you take 15 off the price of a 35,000 euro car, you see a big difference. So I think it's a matter of not spending more money on electric cars, but maybe just distributing the incentives a bit better, I think is the key there.
And just going, John Ringwood is asking, Norway has a 95% hydroelectricity generation, so easy fuel provision, it comes at a competitive price. And what's the prospectus for hydrogen fuel in Ireland, either for personal transport or larger vehicles and freight transport?
Yeah, there is a commitment to have a hydrogen rollout and to introduce hydrogen. I think hydrogen will work in conjunction with electric cars. I don't see hydrogen as an option for passenger cars. It's probably more suitable to shipping and aviation. Even Scania, the truck company, have now moved away from hydrogen and they're moving towards electric vehicles. So, it is in use at the moment in buses, but it's definitely a heavy vehicle solution rather than a passenger car one.
Thank you. And this, I'm going to open up to Lorraine and Eleanor. What data gaps exist to identify the barriers to transport accessibility for women and other excluded groups in terms of mobility impaired, age, and is there sufficient data to support decisions for policy change?
So if you don't mind, I come in on that, and I want to just kind of make kind of reference back to the conversation around electric vehicles, because I think it's really important for us not to just focus on the solution and actually address the problem as well. Because what we're doing by the conversation focusing on electric vehicles is that we really don't have to change anything. We're not addressing anyone's habits. We're incentivizing people to continue with the norms. And, you know, we have a problem with car dependency. We have a problem with the amount of land that we're giving over to the movement of and storage of vehicles, both in our town centres and out in the countryside. What we're going to see now with electric vehicles is now that there's a need for people to plug them in, is people that are going to be paving over their gardens and causing an issue with attenuation and flooding in local areas. We're going to still have the issues about the number of cars on the road preventing our children walking and cycling to school. We still have all of these issues to consider where we don't always necessarily root down to the problem. It is, and this has been an issue for us. And like what I said earlier about the time in relation to, we've justified motorway building based on the time cost savings without addressing how many cars we're actually bringing into our urban centres as a result of these motorways. These motorways have also disincentivized investment in rail and public transport because, you know, it's quicker, easier. We don't have the ridership. They don't have enough people for us to justify investment. So we've had this, like, there's an underlying issue there that needs to be addressed. In relation, and we have an as I mentioned before, we have an overemphasis on the commute. We don't know an awful lot about, you know, the local trips and the determinants of local trips. We have a really good national household travel survey, which it's a good piece of information, but it's a survey. And, you know, I'm a really strong advocate of mixed methods research because we can look at data sets, we can make inferences from data sets, but if we don't actually understand what are the barriers and then go back in and evaluating, we're no good at evaluation when it comes to transport interventions. We don't have the baseline data. And, you know, and investment in sustainable transport modes, you know, we've always had to have a really high burden of proof. We'll build a road without questioning it. You know, we'll do grant incentives around technology without questioning it. But when it comes to investment in walking and cycling, we don't. We put a really huge burden of proof on it. And, you know, and when it comes to research in these areas, we have been riding on the coattails of the co-benefits. There is no dedicated transport research fund in Ireland. So we have to use environmental research funds. We have to use health and physical activity funds to try and then, so we're trying to work off the co-benefits to raise the profile of what should be fundamentally the core of our mobility systems. So that's one of the first things that we need to address. And, you know, we love the bit of tech, we love investing in tech. And, you know, again, it's chasing the money. You know, if we can get companies to invest, if we can get high, you know, advertising revenue around this, you know, whereas when it comes to physical activity and, you know, active travel, it's about health cost savings. It's about it's the betterment of humans. It's not income, it's savings, and that's harder to communicate.
Thank you. That brings us, Eleanor, into culture. Right. So if we talk about the culture, you're saying we have a car dependency culture. We've spoken about some of these issues are gendered. You know, there's some in Ireland, we know compared to other areas, sports for girls is perhaps not as promoted. Girls feel less safe cycling and walking. And so, Eleanor, just in terms of behaviors, you know, how can we change the culture so that girls feel better about cycling or women cycling? One of the things you said is maybe make it a segregated cycle lanes, but there can also be a perception of a very aggressive male culture in cycling that keeps women and children off the roads. I'm just wondering if you could address that, Eleanor, please.
Absolutely. And I guess some of the issues of the current system when it comes to gender are that our current transport systems have been designed historically by men, and only 22% of the workforce in the transport space are female. And at senior leadership levels, it's significantly less than that. And I think that barrier has had a legacy in terms of how the transport sector has evolved up until now, and I think that is something that needs to be addressed going forward in terms of recognizing the heterogeneous needs of males and females in terms of what they need from a transport system. In terms of culture, I think there is definitely a gender issue here as well, and perhaps like let's say if we think about it in terms of the commute, right? There's different workplace expectations placed on men and women in terms of appearance and so on, and you know, a lot of times the facilities that are there in the workplace are not sufficient to allow women to feel like that they can be in the workplace, appear in the workplace coming from on a bike or whatever. So I definitely think there's cultural aspects there, and you know, there is the more cyclists on the road, the more women are going to cycle. And I think the more women that will cycle, it'll reduce that kind of aggressive behavior that you refer to, that when, you know, the king of the road or whatever, you know, it's, I think there's kind of strength in numbers there.
Thank you.
And just to point to two really great pieces of research that have been done recently on women cycling: the Women on Wheels project, which has been done by a subcommittee of the Dublin Cycling Campaign, but also the And She Cycles programme by Green Schools. And in TU Dublin, we're part of a European project Diamond around equity and fairness in transport systems. And, you know, we have an element there on that as well.
What was the name of that second report?
So the And She Cycles.
Okay.
Green Schools. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you.
And Transport Infrastructure Ireland, travelling in a woman's shoes. If anyone hasn't read that document, please do.
Great. Okay. Interesting. Okay. So loads more questions, which is fantastic. So Geraldine, back to you. So if we manage to sell 1 million electric vehicles by 2030, which is a big ask, how does that impact congestion? How can we achieve the parallel goal of reducing the demand for travel? And is there a case for smart road pricing? That comes from Connell.
Well, I kind of mentioned this in my own presentation. I'm not sure that an actual target for putting X number of cars on the road is actually a particularly good one or a particularly effective one. What I think we should be looking at, and certainly any sort of climate action policy should be, is reducing the car fleet over time and moving people into car sharing and various other things like that. I think, and that's why I was stressing that we should be looking at a percentage of the market going electric every year and building it on that. So therefore, instead of aiming to have 1 million cars on the road, maybe we could aim to have 75% of all new car sales and imports being electric. And I think that's a far greater, you know, goal, and it's probably a more feasible one. The other thing is, obviously, we are going to have to look at ways of, if we move that amount of people into electric cars, the fuel revenue, all of those taxes and everything are, you know, they're not actually going to be generated. So we need to look at other ways. And one of the things we could look at is per kilometre usage, you know, that you pay for what you drive, you know, for the amount of driving you do, you pay more. I know they're looking at this in London. The congestion charge at the moment is they're looking at ways that they could actually just dynamically price journeys, because at the moment, if you pay a congestion charge and you do a mile or you do 50 miles, you don't pay any extra, you're just paying for that. Also, it's a very blunt instrument. If you have the money to pay for it, then it's not going to bother you. If you're on a lower income, it is. So it's an unfair tax like that. So I do think, yeah, there is a whole area there that needs to be looked at as to how to get people to pay for the amount of driving they do.
Thank you. Dr. Denny, there's a here about people flying to weddings abroad. So can we just stop people from flying to weddings in Greece?
So what I would say is that, you know, John Fitzgerald put this very well this morning, you know, politicians and our leaders are elected with a mandate. And if that is the will of the people, then they should, vote for politicians who are brave enough to suggest that. But I mean, I think we do need brave and bold leaders, and not just politicians, but leaders in our workplaces, leaders in our communities, in our sports clubs. And, you know, we need a concerted effort on climate across every sector of our society, so that, you know, it kind of becomes ingrained in everything that we do. And, you know, when we start to do that, then our politicians might be more willing to take radical decisions like that. But I think in the more short to medium term, I think that there are ways to kind of inform people about reducing their air travel, and also showing them that not all air travel is the same, that there is significant differences, and allow them to make informed choices, and encourage schemes like carbon offsets and things like that.
And just to follow up then to that, are airlines taxed in proportion to their emissions? Does anybody know?
Yeah.
So you're
as I say to my students, that's an excellent question.
Excellent question. Well, I pause and have a little think. Yes, it's a good question. So they tax on some things, but are they taxed on that? So in terms of policy, that's an interesting one to tease out. Yeah. So thank you for that. I think that comes from Bob. Okay, so a behavioral change question. Actually, I'll come back to you on that. This one then is for Geraldine. Are there any incentives to encourage vehicle fleet operators in Ireland to switch over to electric vehicles?
Yeah, I mean, there is 100% BIK relief. And there is a grant for commercial vehicles as well, and for fleet vehicles. So there is, and I think that's actually becoming a very important market, and going forward, it'll probably be the market that will recover quicker. And then the passenger market will be the fleet market. So yeah, there is incentives. I mean, the incentives, in fairness, in Ireland are very generous, and they're generous in comparison to other European countries. So it's not a lack of incentives. And as I was saying, it's just we need to manage those incentives with limited resources. And the key thing really across the board, whether it's fleet or personal buyers, is the price. And until we get that price parity, I don't think we're going to see that significant market penetration.
Okay. Another question now on climate change. So I don't know who wants to answer this one, but I'll just put it out there. So how do we stimulate people to get out of their comfort zone and move to new paradigms like car sharing schemes, which I know worked very successfully elsewhere, and the adoption and offerings for consumers are low. But how do we improve the offerings and the public's consideration of them? Maybe Lorraine.
So fundamentally, we have to make make it the easiest choice. So making what is the lowest cost, most sustainable, and most environmentally, and healthiest choice, the easiest choice. Because at the moment there is barriers, and people, when we talk about the stages of change and behavior change, people, there's an awful lot of people are in that pre-contemplation stage. They don't even realize that something is available to them, and then they have to go through a contemplation stage. They have to think about it, and they actually have to go through 3 or 4 steps of the behavior change of 5 steps before they actually decide to make an effort to change. And then when they do something, they can fall off the wagon very quickly. And there's a really interesting research around car shares and and even different shared mobilities about, it is those more extroverted people that are drawn to it, and there are those concerns again, like around our health and our virus and the virus and confined spaces. But look, there's a whole load of information that we need to debunk, or like myths that we need to debunk. It is actually, air quality is worse inside your car than outside your car. And EVs are not going to address the particulate issue in relation to air pollution, because 50% of the particulates are coming from the wheels and tire wear and other issues as well. There's a whole load of different pieces of information. And again, it's marketing and awareness. And we have to stop putting a focus on changing schools, going into schools and trying to get the children. For too long, we've taken the easy options. We've built motorways because they've been quick, easy. We have, it's been least disruptive. It's a few farmers we're bothering here, rather than like in an urban area. We only have to look at Strand Road in Dublin to see that what can be drummed up when you're going to an urban location. We go into schools and we do incentives in schools without actually addressing necessarily the infrastructure around, addressing what are the parents do? Are they dropping the kid and then traveling somewhere else? What about that trip? We're kind of forcing things on certain sectors because they're easy and we can access those people easy. We have to look at the more complex problem.
Thank you. Eleanor, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I fully agree with Lorraine, and it kind of comes back to what I was saying in my presentation. We need to remove those frictions, remove those obstacles that are stopping people from doing the right thing and the easy thing to do. And yeah, no, I think Lorraine made comprehensively answered that, so I won't add anything further.
And a follow up on that, a question here from Anthony, just in terms of what generally changes behavioral change more, removing friction or adding fuel?
Removing friction. So like, yeah, humans tend to have a status quo bias, that's what we call it, and they are inclined to just stick with the status quo until you kind of like, I suppose, encourage them to change. But the best way to encourage them to change, and the most sustainable way to encourage them to change, is to remove the barriers. I mean, you can a motivation can have kind of a short-term firing effect, but I mean, if you want to have a longer-term effect, you need to get rid of those barriers.
Thank
Can
you.
I just make another point, and it's something that I want to compliment Geraldine on, and is the general role of media in that information sharing. There's, when it comes to the representation of active and sustainable transport in the media, that there is generally a very polarized, debate, or that there is a kind of an overemphasis. Like, active travel is often like a burden, and it's impinging on people's rights, when really it's actually the opposite. But Geraldine has always presented this really balanced, which is great. But we have to put some responsibility back on media, on local representatives, to make sure that they're actually getting that representative voice of all of those that are living in their neighborhoods. And the conversation needs to change. The conversation needs to be more balanced.
Geraldine, thank you for that. Sorry, Geraldine, somebody's asking here, should we not arrange a public tender to subsidize the rollout of the network of fast EV charging points throughout the road network? There's a market failure, and this is the biggest barrier on the rollout of EV.
Well, I mean, as I said, there's 20 million being invested by the ESB at the moment. That is not going to be enough, but it certainly should be enough to make a change. And I know, talking to EV drivers, that they're already noticing that there is a better service throughout the country. There are private companies that have moved into it. There are a number of private companies that are moving in. They're extending the network all of the time. So I think, in fairness, that is being addressed. The problem is just the time it's going to take to really see an impact. But also, I think it's one of those things that people need the reassurance that they're going to be able to charge. The chances of them actually running out is slim to none. And anyone who's ever driven an electric car knows you get loads of warning and it doesn't happen. You don't go from 400 kilometres to 100 kilometres to 10 to nothing in the space of a few minutes. So I think also it's just those information gaps that we've talked about, and people need to understand how range works, that they don't need to literally see a charging point every 200 meters in order to buy an electric car. So I think we need to also, just as I said, there's an information gap there. Also, just coming back to something else that was said about how we move and change people's behaviour. There was an interesting study in the journal Nature last year about a study that was done in Germany, and they found out that German motorists underestimated the running costs of their car by 50%. And overall, at the end of the study, they concluded that if you actually educated people about the cost of running their car, you could change car ownership by 37%. But these are huge changes that can be made by very simply just informing people of the complete picture. So as I said before, instead of emphasising how cheap it is to run electric cars, I think what we need to do is say to people how expensive it is to actually run the car you have. And therefore, you move people towards car sharing and all to public transport and all sorts of other alternatives. When they actually realise how much it harms their pocket, I think damage to your pocket is actually a great motivator. So I think there's a whole area there that needs to be addressed.
And who do you think should be responsible for that, Geraldine? Is that the Department of the Environment? Is that the media? Is that whose job is that to inform? Well,
again, as Lorraine said, I mean, the media have a role in terms of educating people, informing people, and telling them about various different options. But I think also, as I said, with the SEAI are doing an awful lot of these campaigns about educating people about electric cars. So I think instead of just zoning in on the electric car, we need to also look at advising people about just the general costs of running a car full stop. And just, as I said, filling in those information gaps so people have more information to make a more informed decision. I mean, you still have people who'd say, I don't care how much it costs me, I want my car. But, at least they would make a better and informed decision. So.
Thank you. There's a question in here about carbon offsetting. So is carbon offsetting flights worthwhile, or is that just greenwashing? And are people still willing to pay extra for offsetting carbon emissions? That comes in from Daisy. Eleanor, maybe on that one?
Yeah, so what we saw in that study is that people are willing to pay quite a lot for a reduced carbon flight. So €77 for a reduction in CO2 emissions. And if you look at the cost of a carbon credit now, it's considerably lower than that. So people's willingness to pay is actually higher. And I think it'll have a bigger impact if that, you know, is directed to the people who, to the industries that are creating the carbon, rather than trying to you know, I don't know, offset after the fact. So I think in that sense, I think we need to deal with the source rather than the offsetting, for sure. Yeah.
Thank you for that. There's a good question here from Anya. She makes a very good point. She says, Dublin is not Ireland. We do not all have easy access to public transport, and the nearest shop might be 6 miles away. Lorraine, will you take that one, please?
Yes, as someone who grew up 6 miles from the nearest village, you know, when I talk about the village, I mean the village in every context. It is like that environment in which you can access everything that you need. And, you know, like when it comes to rural transportation, people talking about walking and cycling, you know, up until about 15 years ago, people were comfortable walking and cycling on rural roads. You have to ask yourself, what's the difference? Because like, what has changed? And it's behavior, and it's driver behavior. And now that people have a low expectation, because people haven't been walking and cycling on the roads in recent times, there's a low expectation of meeting someone walking or cycling. Therefore, the driver is less cautious in how they're driving. And we know this. And this is equally as relevant in places where there are guardrails at the side of roads, where we have architecture, where everything is designed around the car. There's, you know, drivers feel like, I'm the protected, I'm the dominant. I can drive whatever way, which way I want. And it's like, and they actually found in Kensington High Street in London, where they, I know that, and now I'm talking about London, even bigger city, but when they took away those barriers, there was a 65% reduction in pedestrian fatalities, because drivers didn't perceive the risk. And risk is key. But coming back to the question on, you know, access, rural public transport is something that we really have to address. And also, you know, it's not about people not having a car. It's not about denying people the right to drive. It's about making spaces and places more equitable for everybody. And, you know, like, it's still about providing spaces for people with disabilities who require the car. Now, we'll also hear from disability groups that they, you know, they feel quite annoyed sometimes that they're being used as a pawn for the provision of parking in places, you know, and they're like, well, when we ask for more provision in public transport for us, we don't get the same support or the same, you know, people saying we need this, you know. So really, we have to have that kind of more integrated, definitely talking to everybody. But in rural locations, we also have to actually, like, you know, and speaking as a country woman, we have to question why people are living in rural one-off housing. What was the motivator? And like right across our whole transport and mobility system, you know, the affordance of housing, right? And that perception. It's like that affordability of an EV, people focusing on the cost of the new house or the new car rather than the lifetime costs to the individual. And across the life course, you know, we do a lot of design based on the assumption that everybody has access to a car and the ability to drive that car. We're seeing a lot of old people being very isolated in rural neighborhoods and not having the public transport. Like our rural public transport system as it is was built off social enterprise. And here's another example where we've been running off co-benefits in relation to sustainable transport. We haven't done like local area plans in relation to public transport in rural locations. These need to happen. We have a rural transport network of really excellent coordinators. I've worked with a few of them. They're brilliant. They need to be given more work or like more integration into the local authorities and more support to actually provide a connected, well-connected system. You'll also find in a lot of these villages and towns, there isn't a regular service that's going to get people into the urban hubs where people are working on time. And so we need to think about our systems there as well.
Well, even things like, I mean, I know when I visit friends outside of Dublin, they spend all the time in their car, bringing their kids to play dates, bringing their kids to school, going to work, dropping them off at the crèche, going grocery shopping. You know, they can't possibly let their kids walk on the rural road because they might be knocked down. There are no pavements, you know, so it is a huge issue. And I just wonder, in some parts of the country, though, were there ever pavements if it wasn't in a village? No, they were just rural pathways, right? So how do you go, we're going to put pavements throughout the country? I mean, what do you do? Or do you say you have to slow people down on the road in cars? How does that work?
It's a cost that's beyond us. We can't put a payment. We have the highest proportion of roads per square kilometre in I think in all of Europe anyway, if not the world. And that's a historical issue. That's that's the context. That's part of the problem, as opposed to, we can't put a footpath in. But what is the footpath in those contexts actually facilitating? It's facilitating, again, it's like putting a barrier in an urban location. It's taking the responsibility away from the driver in relation to their behaviour in their driving. So Road Safety Authority, their remit is protection of lives on the road. It's not, there needs to be a wider focus in their remit. Giving children high-vis jackets, and well-intended and all as it is, what that's doing is it's telling the driver, it's okay, anyone you see walking on the roads is going to have a high-vis on, or else it's their fault. All right, so we're taking, again, it's an issue of risk and perception of risk, and then resulting behaviours. And why children in urban locations are being given high-vis vests is a real bugbear of mine. Our local school has a 65% walking to school, and the kids are being given high-vis vests. It really bothers me.
Some barriers cause other behaviors, don't they? Yeah. So actually, just Eleanor, can you pick up on that? That's an interesting one about friction versus barriers. So is that, by putting kids in high-vis vests, is that the opposite of removing friction? Is it making them, what do you think of that?
It's not something, I have to admit, it's not something I've thought a huge amount about, because I mean, there is certainly the element that Lorraine is talking about there in terms of putting the onus on the pedestrian to make themselves seen, rather than putting the onus on the driver to take more caution. But I would also say, I mean, there is a very visible element to a high-vis vest that, the more people that are wearing them, the more you will be seen to be walking or to be cycling. And as I said before, the more people that do it, the more other people are likely to do it. So I think it's probably two sides to that coin. But
an interesting one. Thank you. Okay, so Geraldine, back to you. There are some price-related issues here on electric vehicles. So Carl asks, what are good reasons for waiting for price parity rather than increasing taxes on ICE vehicles to achieve price parity sooner?
Yeah, I suppose the issue with waiting is, when will it happen? Because at the moment, we know analysts say 2023 to 2025. There's a big difference between those two dates. Also, I suppose in terms of people who want to get into an EV now, it's probably the best time ever, because you get all these grants, you get all these incentives. They will be gone. Once we have price parity and we have competitiveness with EVs, that will be it. EVs will have to stand on their own. There's home charger grants at the moment. There's really good reasons why we shouldn't wait, both as a country and as a consumer. Now is a good time to get in. As I said, if we wait as well until 2025, that really delays things if we have 2030 targets in terms of we've only 5 years to achieve them. And also the other thing is, the more we help the sales of new cars now, the more the secondhand market benefits. So it's not just, I've read these articles recently about how, the SEAI and the government are subsidising the wealthy to buy electric cars. The fact of the matter is, if we don't buy those electric cars new, we don't have a buoyant secondhand market. And a buoyant secondhand market means greater equality for everyone, and means everyone gets the option for 10 or 12,000 to buy an electric car and have all the benefits that go with it. So I think there's a case to be made of not waiting and actually encouraging the sales now.
And as a follow-up to that, should we not be talking more about the total cost of ownership of the vehicles when discussing EVs rather than solely the upfront price or cost?
Sorry, is that for me, Margaret? Because I couldn't hear there.
Sorry. Yeah. He wants to know, should we be talking about the total cost of ownership of an EV as opposed to just the upfront price or cost?
Absolutely. There's no doubt about it when you compare the two. This is the thing, most people will argue now there's price parity already, because if you actually work out how much it's going to cost me to service, it's negligible because there's so few moving parts. The running cost per week, you can do about 300 kilometres a week for €4 on your ESB bill. That's going to cost you about 25 in petrol, maybe 21 or 22 in diesel. Huge differences on a weekly basis. But the problem still is, it's just that initial investment we're asking people to make, and then they recoup that investment over a couple of years. It's, as I said, Irish people, when they walk into dealerships, 3 cars that look exactly the same, but the one with the electric battery has a huge price premium in comparison. And that is the biggest problem. You can talk about ownership and talk about total cost of ownership, but people tend to still fixate on that sticker price, and that sticker price is still considerably higher. So that's what the issue is.
And there's a back to where we were talking about airlines, and somebody says airlines are part of the EU emissions trading scheme, so they do not pay carbon tax on aviation fuel.
Great.
And Bob is saying, so motorists pay tax on fuel and more tax on the level of emissions their car generates, but airlines don't pay any.
Can I just make a point?
Following up on what Geraldine was saying there about the total cost of ownership, some research that we've done has kind of showed that it's not enough just to show people the total cost of ownership, that there is a segment of the market that want to buy an EV for environmental reasons. And if you focus solely on the cost in your pocket, you have the danger of crowding out those people who want to do it for environmental purposes. If you only show the environmental information, you crowd out those who want to do it for financial reasons. So, you know, it's important to kind of push the two messages, I would say.
Thank you.
And on a similar note, I think the conversation does need to also, well, I think it's actually more important that the conversation shouldn't be on the individual cost of ownership of an EV, but actually on the societal cost of a car-dominated environment and society, and what the greater costs and well-being, and you know, and especially in relation to just transition, because like, you know, are we going to be shaming those who can't afford to change their car or choose not to change their car? Are we going to be, you know, like green shaming those that, like, you know, if they decide to keep their old car rather than, you know, spending on a new car and maybe invest in a cargo bike, like let's also, you know, address the cost of an e-cargo bike. It's the cost of a second-hand car. Like, you're talking €3,500. So like, really, we should be grant incentivizing those for people living in urban and peri-urban and rural outside of villages as well. You know, we're expanding that space. So it's a much more efficient, as I say, energy efficient way of moving people, you know, and that results in physical activity, better benefits to our overall health. So Niall Mina, my former colleague of mine up in DCU, when I used to work in sports science, he you know, he mentioned recently about, like, you know, 50% of the people in Ireland, in Europe, but in Ireland as well, are overweight and obese, of the children. And he was, and then he was pointing out, like, of a particular 10% of the cohort of children that are in that severely obese. Those people are going to result in nearly 80 to 90% of our health costs down the line, right? And we know how expensive our health system is. Now we take the medical approach. We treat disease rather than prevent it. Here's another example. You know, as a society, we deal with problems, not the source of the issue. And you know, like we need to look at the overall cost of a car-dominated of a system, and we put it in a huge amount of our expertise and resources onto that, you know, big investments.
Thank you so much. What a brilliant panel. Thank you. So much information there. And thank you to everybody who asked the Q&As, all very interesting. So a big round of applause there for Sustainable Transport and Behavioural Change with Dr. Lorraine D'Arcy, Geraldine Herbert, Dr. Eleanor Denny, and me. I'm Margaret Ward, and I'd like to hand it over to John Fitzgerald. Thank you very much.
right. Welcome back to this wrap-up session. It's going to be difficult to beat the last panel, in particular with the very short presentations and the really wide-ranging discussion. Anyway, this is the end of a great day. So what I was going to ask for the three other participants, what they have learned in particular from the session that they chaired. So Frank McGovern, what did you learn in particular? What stands out for you from the session on energy efficiency in buildings?
Yeah, thanks, John. And we really had a very good session, really excellent presentations. And I suppose what came across to me is the sort of complexity of the solution space and the challenges that are there. It seems simple, it's our houses, our buildings, but it's not. It's much wider than that. It's the street we live in, the community, and the influences there. The other thing that came across to me is the standards that we have, such as BERS, can be confusing and may not be the key indicator of whether the house is energy efficient or not. And that other factors drive people's choices. They may just wish to live in a city, even if they're a city centre, even if the BER rating is very low. And I guess the key thing is the human dimension. There's so many solutions out there, but it's a bit like TV channels. There's too many in the end, and you just end up switching off. And the final point, I think there was a key point made on managing price signals and energy poverty. We need price signals work in certain ways, but unless they're handled carefully, energy poverty can be enhanced. And I thought that was a key message there.
Right, Phil.
Thank you, John. Yes, a good session from the second panel as well. So I might just summarize very briefly the key points that I heard from the speakers. So our first speaker on the panel was Damien Flynn from UCD. He talked about the concept of moving from looking at power systems to looking at energy systems, so a much broader perspective. I was very interested to learn that cruise ships can cause problems for the electricity grid. That's certainly a story I'd like to hear a little bit more about. One of the key messages I think that came from Damien's talk, or certainly what I took from it, was that there's still a lot of open questions, around, for example, the stability of the grid and what are the limits there, around the need to build or otherwise new lines to facilitate growth in demand, growth in new generation, so new wind farms, solar farms, offshore, etc. The growth and nature of self-consumption, and also the need and desirability for seasonal storage, whether or not that will become a feature of our system. The second speaker then was Mark Foley, CEO of EirGrid. Mark spoke about a revolution as opposed to an evolution of our power system in the next decade. He talked about a range of targets landing on EirGrid and I suppose the system from a broader perspective. So he talked about 10,000 megawatts in terms of new renewable connections in the coming years. He talked about an improved performance in reinforcing the grid, so a little bit of self-reflection there at organization level. So he was speaking about EirGrid's need to constantly improve their own performance. He spoke about the delivery and facilitation of interconnection and mentioned the Celtic interconnector and the Greenlink interconnector in particular, and about supporting a 95% renewables on the system. He also spoke about challenges. He talked a little bit about COVID and what that's meant for EirGrid's business. He talked about winning the hearts and minds, so trying to get everybody involved and appreciating the challenge that we have collectively. He spoke about interconnection being a challenge. He talked a little bit about data centers and what appears to be a relatively inevitable growth of demand from data centers. So he talked a little bit about a policy framework there, about how we organize how and when those data centers come. He talked about security of supply, and lastly then infrastructure considerations. The third and final speaker then on the panel was Donna Gartland, the CEO of Codema. So she spoke a little bit about the correlation between very high levels of renewable heat and the 6 countries with the highest levels of renewable heat also had very significant deployment levels of district heating. For me, it was quite a complicated picture though, because if you take out those 6 countries at the very top and you look at the rest of the countries in the EU, there's very limited or no district heating deployment in those countries. So I thought that presented an interesting picture. She spoke a little bit about the potential opportunities for using waste heat and other heat generating technologies, for example, deep geothermal energy, and how district heating might help unlock those opportunities. She spoke about sector coupling of the electricity and heat sectors and how they might be able to complement each other. And lastly, then she indicated that whilst we have pretty good mechanisms for electricity infrastructure planning, for transport planning, and for gas planning, her feeling was that we need an increased focus on heat sector infrastructure planning. So there are my key takeaways, John.
And Margaret?
Yeah, so I guess the main thing I learned is that we really need joined up thinking around the way that we move around. So my panel was Sustainable Transport and Behavioural Change. And there was an interesting statement made by one of the contributors. She said, we need brave and bold workplaces. And that really involves policies and government policymakers, politicians, really thinking about things that incentivize behavioral change. So a couple of people made the point that, we tax fuel consumption for cars, but we don't, tax airlines for their fuel. Behavioral change, we really need to improve our offerings and make it as easy as possible for people to make the right choice in terms of the environment. We need a better infrastructure. Also that some of our transport options are quite gendered. So women don't cycle as much, for example. They might not take public transport as much in some areas if they don't feel it's safe. Also, the role of the media and perhaps consumer or personal finance journalists, and I guess that's my own background, so that interested me in terms of really helping motorists and others understand the true costs of having a car or a bicycle, and that can change their behavior, and also things that like planning. So our public transportation planning, particularly in rural Ireland, has not been looked at as much as it should. So very interesting discussion and great participation on the Q&A, which was very appreciated.
Mary Donnelly said that she can't be here this afternoon, but she said that her takeaway from the first panel was we have a plan, but we need to implement it. And it's policies actually doing something. And I think it's taking up on your point, Margaret, that the sooner we start, the better, as every day, every month, every year counts. So I think that point resonated. One of the things which resonated for me was actually Donna Gartland's piece on district heating, that we face a huge challenge which your panel, Frank, the built environment panel, focused on, that we are, of all the sectors in Ireland, when you compare us to the rest of Europe, we are worst on the household sector, that we emit 3 times as much carbon per head as a household in, say, Spain or Denmark. So I hadn't really focused on district heating. And the problem is, if we go down the route which we're talking about, retrofitting all the houses, that could cost 50 billion. And it's households will have to pay the bulk of it, or maybe more even in the next 30 years. And households today spend 3 billion on energy. If they saved 3/4 of that, they'd save the actual rate of return with no discounting would be only 4% on their investment. So to persuade people that to persuade most households to spend 50,000 on doing up their house, and we have to, and I think the point was made by Brian in your session, Frank, that we have to decarbonize the household sector. However, the district heating, Donna was talking about 600 million to lay the pipes to bring hot water to a lot of Dublin. In terms of climate change, the important point is that hot water would be waste heat or would not be from a fossil fuel source. So you don't worry too much about energy efficiency if you've decarbonized. So that option was one I hadn't really focused on. And another one which wasn't talked about at all long term is methane, green methane as an alternative. So I don't know whether any of you, whether Phil, Frank, what you thought, where we're going to go on this. What is likely to be the answer for dealing with the household sector, and what do you take out of what you heard?
John, can I come in there? I picked up on the point about Donna, certainly about that waste heat, that the fact that it's cheaper now to dump energy, really, than it is to manage it. And that's quite extraordinary in the situation that we're in. And yes, I saw complete resonance between the house situation, and I suppose she went as far as the doorstep. And then how do we cross that doorstep? And that's a key barrier in bringing those solutions in. And what are the, I suppose, the policy structures and investments that we need? As you say, it seems obvious, but that goes back to the McKinsey report. There's so many things there that are really, win-wins on the face of it. But the key issue is, I suppose, our homes, our human spaces that we live in, and there's a whole different dimension there. But we have to, I suppose, disrupt the home to make it better, and that's not easy.
Phil, do you want to, and
Sure.
then Margaret?
Yeah, I might just add briefly to Frank's comments. I think, John, what you outlined there was the economic argument in terms of retrofitting houses, which is certainly very valid. I think it's one very significant part of the picture, but there are other pieces to the jigsaw as well that are important to think about. I mean, I suppose if you simplify the argument a little bit and you take it that, well, would we not retrofit and would we just have more district heating, more technology, more renewables, more solar panels on our homes or whatever? I guess the issue with that from a very broad perspective is that not retrofitting or shallow retrofitting will lead to higher demand and therefore the need for more infrastructure. So you never really escape that loop of needing more and more to supply the needs. There's also things to consider, such as there's thermal comfort in retrofitted homes as well. Having moved from a house with a pretty low BER to one with a relatively high one, my sense is that in Irish society, a lot of us have accepted discomfort in our homes as the norm. Just accepted that when it's cold, our houses are cold and we heat one room and so on. So I suppose the higher level point is I think we need to tackle both the supply and the demand sides of the equation, as opposed to just one or the other.
Margaret?
Yeah, I guess for me, all that, comes back to something that panel said over and over again, which is really, it's about behavior. So what you said, Frank, there, you said, it's cheaper to dump energy now. It's cheaper to dump energy now. So what can we do to make it as easy as possible for that not to be the case? So what behaviors do we need to change in individuals? What policies do we need to have? And also that thing about consumers not having all the information they need in order to make the right choices. That seemed to be a big thing, that when they do, and as that study that was cited about Germany, that 37% of German motorists underestimated the cost of running their car by 50%. That says something. So linking all those things together about information for consumers, behavior, and policy, again, resonates there.
Yeah, Geraldine, Margaret, I thought Geraldine's point on the fact that German motorists undervalue the savings by 50%, and there's a huge study done for the US with exactly the same result. American car owners, when they buy a car, underestimate the cost of the potential savings by 50%. So that's in terms of how you bring it home to people. Behavioral science is going to be really important. Now, it's not simple in that 15 years ago, I think, the government had a series of advertising campaigns basically saying, be good on the environment. And the SRI subsequently studied them, both electricity and gas, and found they had no effect. They were a waste of money. So this is not something pulling my levers and making me do what you want. It's not easy. Mark Foley also talked about, for him, the real challenge was getting public acceptance to the changes that we need in order to decarbonize the energy system and ultimately the economy. I don't know if Phil, whether you have anything on that.
Sure, yeah, and I mean, public acceptance has long been one that has been important and needs to be thought about. I think it goes up a level in complexity when we start to go in a major way offshore with energy infrastructure. You know, we see out to 2030 planning for very significant offshore wind farms, and when compared to onshore facilities, there's the extra complexity of trying to understand and unpick who the community is that's affected. So if you build an onshore wind farm of a certain size, it's relatively straightforward to understand who might be the discommoded folks, you know, within the vicinity. If you build a large offshore wind farm off Dublin, for example, or Cork or anywhere else, you know, who's the community? So there's very direct folks that are very directly affected, fisher people and so on, shipping companies. But you know, there could be thousands upon thousands of people viewing the offshore wind farm. So there's certainly big challenges there. I mean, I think there are some good things that are happening in terms that will help with public acceptance, and I think it would be remiss of me not to mention the fact that the electricity smart services enabled by smart meters are going live tomorrow, so that finally becomes a reality. So what does that mean? Well, it brings microgeneration into the picture a little bit more. It's going to give customers over time better insights into their own consumption. It's going to give them more accurate bills, so there'll be no more estimated meter readings when people have their smart meters. It will allow the opportunity to use time of use tariffs for people to save money or contribute to decarbonisation. And it's just one of these things that helps to bring society into the fold in terms of the decarbonisation journey, and it will help hopefully to connect them to it on an individual level rather than heretofore. It's been a lot of companies playing in the space to a large extent.
Although I should say, having when my smart meter was installed, I asked what it told me and how to read it. And the explanation, I did get an explanation. As a technology nerd, it was exceptionally off-putting. So the people of Ireland, I think there's a job to be done on apps and on simple ways of communicating information. And the behavioral research which has been done, for example, on smart meters showed that if somebody received, if the information just comes in your 2-monthly bill, that people did not take energy saving options. It was only if you had a meter in the kitchen which turned red when you are consuming electricity at a peak hour, and it was going to be very expensive. That was the only thing that brought or was essential in terms of change. So I think behavior, I think there's, I know you're now moved to the CRU. I think you've got a lot of work to do there. Eleanor, I thought a really interesting presentation. I thought the steps with the calories on them, hadn't seen that one before. That was nice. Her result on aviation was fascinating, because if you just mandate airlines to say what the carbon is, airlines will be driven to look for more efficient aircraft, because actually they can charge much more if they're efficient. The problem is why do we have electric cars? It's because there's regulations, there's prices. The motor manufacturers aren't doing it because they love it, they have to. Whereas in aviation, Airbus and Boeing haven't done so because there's no tax in aviation fuel. So that'd be a great driver. So I thought that was very...
Yeah, and
Margaret.
the other side of that that's interesting as well, John, is, you know, she put up all those things saying, okay, people are willing to pay for, you know, direct flights. They're willing to pay for an extra baggage allowance. I can't remember what the third thing was. But would they be willing to pay for all those three and pay the additional €77, you know, for carbon offset? Or would they drop some of those? You know, like, so how price sensitive is it? I'd be curious to look at positioning it in terms of what consumers would prioritize, because that would be a very interesting study going forward. Because, of course, if that's fourth on the list, that's not going to make airlines change their behaviors as much as if it was first or second.
In terms of how we make ourselves change, or persuade ourselves change, or nudge ourselves to change, sort of what kind of policy conclusions would you draw? I thought it was interesting on the built environment. Lisa Ryan said targeting the houses off the gas grid first. And they're ones who don't have the option of district heating. And they do have the option of using biomass, whereas burning a load of wood in cities is not necessarily the best way of heating your house. Margaret, were there policy conclusions which you took from your session?
Yeah, I mean, again, that thing that keeps coming back to me was brave and bold. Brave and bold. And I think that's where we are. You know, we need our politicians and our academics and people in industry to come together and say, we need to be brave and bold. So why can't Ireland be the best in the world for this? You know, why can't we get the communicators together and the behavioral economists and, you know, people who are good at messaging to, you know, public service messaging and say, this is where we want to go? Because it really, there does seem to be a big disconnect here. People aren't talking to one another. You're not looking at the joined up thinking. So if we put this policy in, how do we create behavioral change with that? But how do we communicate that more clearly? And then what comes down at the end of that? So I think we really need to get together and stop the siloed thinking.
Geraldine raised the issue that the government receives 5 billion in revenue from road transport. And when we electrify the cars, and she repeatedly said this, there's huge incentives. It's very, and the IGES, the Government Economic Service, has estimated that to meet our target with the current incentives will cost the state 10 billion. She raised the issue of charging per kilometre as the way to go in the future. I don't know what you thought of that. Economists love charges rather than sort of feel-good factors. But
well, there was something that she said. Did she say that we have the highest proportion of kilometre of road per person? Yeah. I thought that.
No, I think that was Lorraine.
Oh, sorry, that was Lorraine who said that. And I thought that was very, very interesting. So if we then started to try to charge people per kilometre, what would happen? I don't know. What do you think as an economist?
I think the problem, just wearing my climate change hat, I am determined that we decarbonise Ireland, and that's the priority. If you take somebody in Belmullet who's going shopping in Castlebar, and Lorraine would say, well, why do they have to go to Castlebar? Well, actually, if you want to buy clothes, you won't get much in shops in Belmullet. What damage will you do to the environment? If you drive an electric car, if we have decarbonised electricity, what damage are you doing to society? The road is there. There's no congestion on the road. So actually, why should they pay? And it's quite a long distance from Belmullet to Castlebar to shop. Whereas people in urban areas, not only when you commute, if you have fossil fuel car, you're emitting carbon, but also you're causing congestion. So as an economist, I love the idea of congestion charges, and that rural drivers are paying too much and urban drivers are paying too little, and we should all be on public transport in urban areas anyway. So that's my, but economists, the world would be a sad place if it was run by economists. It might go broke if there are none, but Frank.
Yeah.
Policy conclusions.
Conclusion, John. I suppose one of the things that I suppose you mentioned earlier is what was omitted and what was missing. Yeah. And I actually think we were very much talking about the now and 2030. We never really sort of got that vision for 2050 or that pathway thinking for 2050. And I think you'd appreciate this, that unless we see how we link these things up, we might make what seem sensible decisions now for policies and investments, but in the long term are on the wrong trajectory. So I think we need more of that long term, the totality of decarbonisation of Ireland and how we do that. And remember, we have to get to net zero CO2 before 2050 if we're going to get all greenhouse gases negative in 2050.
Yeah, and Peter Thorne made that point.
Yeah.
And he made that point that the climate is going to, even if we stop emitting carbon, the climate is going to continue to change for the next 100 years, maybe the next 200 years. So he made the point, and that infrastructure we put in place, I think was it Peter or somebody else, the infrastructure we put in place needs to be robust in the face of that. Phil, what do you, actually Mark said he was going to, his focus was on getting the target to 2030, and second order was Frank's point about after 2030. I don't know what your thoughts, Phil, are on what was missing. Or
sure, I think following on from Frank's comment about the longer term piece, one thing that was raised as part of the panel I chaired was the point around the circular economy, and I thought it was fascinating, and certainly I think it's very important that alongside this rapid movement to decarbonize all elements of society, which is certainly very necessary and very welcome, that we don't fall into the trap of storing up future problems for us in the longer term. So just to take a couple of examples of that, if you take the repurposing of retired wind turbine blades. So in Ireland, for example, now we're coming to the point where the first or the early onshore wind farms are getting towards their end of life. There's a question around, well, what happens to those wind turbines if a more efficient plant are put up? If you look at some examples of what has happened in the US, there has been a lot of landfilling of wind turbine blades because there hasn't been so much research invested in repurposing of them. And that applies right across a range of different areas of decarbonizing. So solar panels, for example, we've seen absolutely massive efficiency gains in solar panels. I wonder what's happening to those solar panels that are now less efficient. I don't know the answer to it. Similar with EV batteries, what happens when they get to end of life? I know there is quite a lot of research ongoing in that space. It's certainly very interesting, but it's probably something that isn't as attractive to talk about. So I was certainly glad to see that raised as part of the panel discussion.
Margaret, Lorraine, your session, there was a lot of talk about how to live differently, which would involve, in particular, planning, the planning system and where we build. It was something which Donna also raised, and I think Lisa did as well, that planning for the future, we're going to build 40-50% more dwellings in Ireland in the next 30 years, and where we put them and how we develop a different lifestyle. So Margaret, your take on this.
Oh gosh, I have so much to say about the poor planning in this country compared to other countries. We don't really seem to have much of a history of urban planning. Okay, more recently. But if you go to other cities and rural areas, you see that they really did think about how people work and live when they were designing them. So, I mean, I would love to see, a rich, deep, academic and practical approach to planning Ireland, like planning Ireland for 2050, not just planning Ireland, as was made on my panel, for cars or planning Ireland for business, but planning Ireland for people and the people who live here. Because more and more, if we start to see more of these viruses and other things which make us live in a smaller radius, we need to really think about that 10 to 15 minute walk from our home, don't we? In terms of that, the 15-minute livable village. And I would love to see that. I think that we have a very good quality of life here, but the things that make our quality of life poor tend to be down to bad planning, and that we put the interests of business and corporations and the economy above the interests of people. And I think you have to marry those two things together.
The National Planning Framework really does that and lays out what we should be doing. The problem is it's not happening on the ground in the development since it was published.
Right. And look, so that's lack of political will, isn't it?
Yeah.
And so, but as citizens then, is that our job then, that we should be pressing and say we want a more livable country?
Probably the best example of urban planning in Dublin was the Wide Streets Commissioners in the late 18th century. However, they took no objections. They just demolished stuff and paid no attention to the locals who are being kicked out to make Westmoreland Street and D'Olier Street. 200 or 250 years on, they did a great job, but it can be easier to make major changes if you don't have to consult and you don't have to take account of people's views. So, Phil, I think we're coming to the end of this session. What final message, Phil, did you take from today?
I think just in terms of a sum up message, I would be quite hopeful. Over the course of a relatively short period of time, let's say the last decade, climate action has gone from a conversation that was arguably quite niche to one that is now quite normal. I mean, we're all here today speaking about it. So I take a lot of hope and inspiration from that. I think my eyes will certainly be peeled for the next climate action plan when it comes out. My experience of the 2019 one is that it has had a very significant effect of helping to align the work of different government departments and different public agencies around the climate action challenge that we all have. And I mean, even just looking at the 2019 one, I mean, there were remarkable levels of ambition on several fronts in the 2019 edition. If you look at things that were mentioned earlier today, bringing home retrofits to 50,000 per year, the 70% target for renewable electricity, the 1 million EV target, EVs on the road by 2030 that got a lot of discussion in Margaret's panel. Maybe a target to have 1 million less ICE vehicles on the road might be more appropriate after hearing that discussion. But I think there's an awful lot of energy, pardoning the pun, behind climate action now, and I think everybody is raising their game, and I think it's just a really exciting time, and I think a lot of challenges ahead, but certainly a very interesting time to be in this space.
Frank, a last word from you, and then Margaret.
Yeah, no, I'd echo a lot of what Phil said, but I mean, we need integrated systems for energy management. And for that, we need communication and motivation. We have to make this simple and we have to make it attractive for people. And I think, if I may say, the session I was dealing with on housing and homes, that'll be central to it. If we can get that across the line, then everything else will fall in place, because it is so core to how we should want to live.
Margaret?
Communication, clear communication with consumers and community, I think, is going to be key to all of this, but that has to be led from the top. Otherwise, we won't see any change.
Yeah, that's reiterating what Mark said in the second panel. I must say, I end up the day more hopeful than I began. There are options and ways of doing things which I wasn't aware of, or which are easier or better. So I suppose that's a good ending. Also, I think that the political system is, and as I said it at the beginning, is more attuned to taking action. I thought it was interesting to hear the minister comment very favorably on the previous minister from a different party on the original climate action. And in terms of the Oireachtas committee, I think it's important that it's across the board. So I end the day more hopeful, which is probably the way to go out. So thank you all. Great session, and thanks to all the speakers.
Yes, and thanks, Chair. Excellent chairing.